We as ADB need to incorporate digital into our DNA. We also need to do more to help the region accelerate its digital transformation. Together, we can emerge from the pandemic stronger, more inclusive, and sustainable.
Hello, and welcome to Digital X ADB and part 2 of the soft underbelly of digital government and the digital economy session on cybersecurity. And those of you who joined us from the morning session on cloud computing, welcome back. I'm Yoonhee Jung with Digital Technology for Development Unit at ADB and your host for today. So this morning, we started off with a keynote from Karan Bhatia of Google on the roadmap for digital transformation, followed by an in-depth yet practical discussion on how governments could transition to cloud. So I hope you're all really excited to this dialogue on cybersecurity and how it underpins the digital enablement and transformation of the region. Before we begin, just a quick reminder to please use the Q&A function to pose questions to the speakers throughout the session. So with that housekeeping out of the way, it's my pleasure to invite the moderator, Mr. Arnd Huszar, Senior Public Management Specialist on Digital Transformation at ADB, to get the session started. Arnd, over to you.
Thank you, Yoonhee. And many of you would have joined us this morning for our first session of the day, which was focused on cloud computing as an enabling soft infrastructure of digital government and the digital economy. In this session, we turn to another crucial enabler of digital transformation, cybersecurity. As we will hear from our panelists, threats in cyberspace have been growing. And as we move even more of our personal and professional lives online, purchase goods and services via the internet, and connect our assets to digital systems, our vulnerability to bad actors increases. At the same time, the good actors are not staying idle. Innovations in cybersecurity have meant that modern security systems now deploy the latest in data analytics and artificial intelligence. We have gained a better understanding of how to integrate biometrics and behavioral science in the procedures that all of us practice daily to access digital systems, to verify our identities, and to transact online. Cybersecurity is core to digital transformation and is a shared responsibility that requires collaboration between government and private sector, between individuals and their organizations. We believe that international financial institutions like the ADB have a role to play. We need to keep up to speed with developments in cybersecurity. We need to learn, adapt, and share our experience with our partners. Nowadays, our loan and technical assistance projects are often packed with digital solutions that need to be cyber secure. The operating systems of crucial infrastructure assets we finance are digital and increasingly connected to the web. This includes our portfolio in crucial public infrastructure like water supply, energy networks, transport systems, undersea fiber optic cables, etc., etc. Digital technology has become a core part of our work. Of course, we need to manage cybersecurity at ADB, but given our role in fostering sustainable development in developing Asia and the Pacific, we also need to think about the broader ecosystems that we are a part of. Together with our partners, we need to advance cybersecurity and take a systems approach. As our region goes digital, cybersecurity should not be an afterthought. Now I'd like to introduce our fantastic group of panelists by order of appearance. You'll hear brief presentations from each of them, followed by a Q&A session. We invite you to post your questions via the Q&A module for us to be able to address them during Q&A time. First up, I'd like to introduce Peter Fazell. Peter leads information security at ADB. focused on enabling the business to pursue leading digital transformation strategies while reducing risk to the organization and increasing operational effectiveness. He has many years of experience in information security and technology within banking, government, managed services, and defense. Prior to ADB, his roles in banking included technology and risk management roles at the Commonwealth Bank, ANZ, USB, RBS, ABN AMRO, and Deutsche Bank. Next up will be Mary Jo Schrade. Mary Jo is an Assistant General Counsel and Regional Lead for Microsoft's Digital Crimes Unit Asia, and is based at Microsoft's Cyber Security Center in Singapore. She oversees the initiatives, programs, and strategies related to Microsoft Asia's efforts to prevent or disrupt organized cybercrime and online tech support scams through public-private partnerships, coordinated enforcement, and customer engagements relating to cybersecurity and Microsoft's digital trust commitment to its customers. And finally, we have Bart Hogeveen. Bart is head of cyber capacity building at the Australian Strategy Policy Institute. At ASPI's International Cyber Policy Center, he focuses on international peace and security, international aid, and national security aspects of cyber affairs. ASPI's cyber capacity building program comprises a range of initiatives that look at supporting states with the development of national cybersecurity strategies, strengthening ICT capacities in developing nations, and enhancing regional mechanisms for stability in cyberspace. Bart is also a member of the advisory board of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, GFCE, the global platform for cyber capacity building. Now, with this fantastic panel coming up, I don't want to waste anybody's time any longer and hand over to our first presenter, Peter Fazell, to give us a take on how ADB views the space of cyber.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. As mentioned, Peter Fazell, ADB's CISO. I also have a second title, which is ADB's Principal Information Security Officer. Excuse me just one moment while I share. I've been asked to talk today to provide some guidance, process framework, how a developing digital, how a developing organization might first adopt a digital presence. So I'm going to talk about something I call the cybersecurity umbrella, explain kind of why the concept of an umbrella is quite relevant. And then I'll talk through some frameworks and some more practical implementations of how to do that.
Peter, if you can put it in full screen, that would be awesome. Right now it's
I'm sorry, I'm not a native. I was in screen mode. Let me just.
Thank you. Perfect.
So start. What's a cyber concept? Again, I'll talk about how important it is to understand the business goals and objectives and line up with their risk appetite. Walk through creating a governance model and then how you actually manage and operate that framework. So the cyber analogy, I'm hoping this picture kind of makes it really quite clear. You know, cybersecurity is a shield or a blanket that needs to protect an organization. If you've got holes in it, then it's just not effective. So, you know, that sounds nice and easy to achieve, but in reality, how do you make sure that your cyber umbrella is operating effectively and keeping your organization secure? So the way I recommend that someone approaches this is, first of all, you know, talk to your business, understand the risk appetite, what do people want to achieve, what risks does an organization willing to take and accept. You know, having worked for defences and international banks, they have a very, very different appetite to sharing information perhaps to that of which ADB does. ADB might be happy to provide access to certain materials, but some organisations won't. And unless you understand that business objective and business goal, then you can't really set your framework up. So here's a couple of steps to do that. Risk registers, engage your business, define who's accountable for different components, define how an organisation is going to steer and manage its cybersecurity, who makes decisions, where risks go, and if needed, write a business case. The business case will do a couple of things. Hopefully make your senior stakeholders aware of what you're after, get their sign off that it is indeed what you're after, and then provide you some additional funding if needed. Again, that understanding of business goals and objectives is also something that needs to kind of go on constantly. Organisations evolve, new strategies come out, and so does the way that you address those. So on to the how. So as part of this, there's lots of great ways you can address cybersecurity. One of the most important things I'd say is if you adopt the standard, then you're kind of covering all the different panes that you need to. NIST recently released version 5. NIST version 1 is a really early NIST, but it provides a good framework. It talks about different components. ISO 27001, another global standard that sort of tells you more about what you need to protect rather than actually getting to the details to say ISO 27002, which will then go in and actually tell you how and ask you about controls. This is kind of big picture. And on that big picture approach, there's a couple of things we do. So, as you start to develop that, so okay, I have my different panes of my umbrella, my different components, and now I've got policies around those, I've got defined standards. That's great. So if we write standards and policies, we publish processes, we let the organisation know what's required of them. So it's not just what they want of us. Oh, we want to be cyber safe, we want to be protected, we want to be able to share information. Great. Okay, to do that, you need to have some responsibility as well. So that's set those standards, sort of define your policies, procedures, standards, and then kind of think, all right, well, as we start to roll out projects, how are we going to address those? So we have different controls through different stages of projects, whether that's planning, analysis and build, test, deploy. So when we go to plan, many people come to me and say, can I have a checklist? I want to run a project. Can I have a checklist? My response to that is, well, a checklist is great. If you really want a checklist, then please provide me a list of every project you're going to do, and then I'll provide you controls around that. So what we do in ADB, we have something called our security guardrails. And our guardrails are those areas we think that projects need to think about what they're going to do. And that's the diagram on the right. So how are you going to define your authorization, authentication? Does the business operate four-eyed controls? And if you do, well, then you don't have to have such layered defenses. How are you going to handle data, storage, monitoring, all these different components that go into the cyber framework. And most importantly, different documents, configuration reviews, all these different things that go live. In ADB, we have a concept that we call our security license to operate. So when a project wants to deploy, we ask them to provide evidence that all these different components of our guardrails and a much stricter set of requirements, including potentially penetration tests, cloud risk assessments, have been completed and signed off as appropriate and within the risk appetite of the organisation. So that security license to operate is where we kind of go from the theory to the practical. Okay, you want to have an application, you want to put information on the internet. All right, how's it secure? You want to go live? Great. All right, before you go live, show us these controls are in place and operating. And a framework's great, but you need to have those governance gates where people can show you they're operating. Everyone's well-intentioned, but things don't always go to hand. Which leads on to the next stage. So you've understood what the business wants, you've got it out there, you've built it. Once it's live, it can't be forgotten. Best laid plans, sometimes fall apart. A developer or a troubleshooter, oh, it's got to be this. I'm just going to turn that off temporarily. forgets to turn it back on. So the way we handle that is we do regular control assessments. So we look at the policies and processes we've applied and we say, are they actually operating? We take test samples and ensure that they operate at different components on different services and systems. We actually run a hygiene team. We have our hygiene team actually goes out there and does those day-to-day controls that we expect everyone to operate. You know, things like key rotation for all our SSL and encryption keys, access reviews to the business. You know, we patch and do vulnerability assessments of our systems. You know, lots of internet banking sites go up, but they need regular maintenance, regular patching, you know, internet applications. We do lots of reporting applications. If we don't make sure that those applications are patched and free from vulnerabilities, then those systems are likely to be compromised. And with compromised, you face all those horrible risks around, you know, financial loss, reputational damage. So again, you know, we ensure we have a patching service, we ensure we manage vulnerabilities, and our hygiene team actually make sure that these operate. We do regular configuration reviews. Just because an application was configured or a system was configured correctly when it went live, lots of things go on. Sometimes you roll out upgrades and patches and they change some of your settings. So by ensuring you're actually running these hygiene activities, like managing your configs, then you can, you know, protect your digital self. Firewall reviews, again, people put in things to troubleshoot. Firewalls are, you know, the big hard shell that I guess protects many things, even though there's many layer controls. Again, you know, as part of our hygiene, we back up our systems, but we don't just back them up. We actually test and restore them. And so these are important to develop this hygiene framework. The diagram on the right kind of shows different controls we operate at different stages of the process. And those all those controls we brought all through our project development, our SDLC framework, our software development lifecycle, we actually make sure are tested and operating effectively in our hygiene stage. Things go wrong. So once you're operating, you know, you need to have an incident management approach. You need to decide how you're going to operate, who operates what, how you're going to 9 to 5 people, potentially practice these, run exercises. Are you going to pay ransomware? If you get ransom, is that in line with your organizational appetite? You know, these are great things to kind of have people think about in advance of something going wrong. You know, in the heat of the moment, people get emotive and don't necessarily make the clearest of decisions. But if you've practiced and rehearsed, then hopefully things go more in line as the organization would want them to. You know, pre-canned or pre-written communications. So if we have a loss of confidential data, how will we handle it? If a site's compromised, getting information out early really does help enhance or limit the damage to your reputation. The last kind of thing, you know, I think is quite important is as systems change, changes are always going to be made. Ensure you have proper governance over that. You know, are changes approved? Are the controls still operating? Does your system go live? And once it goes live, do you have a backup plan if there should be problems? So in a nutshell, that's a very brief overview of a simple framework for how an organisation can protect itself, particularly if you're just starting out in that journey. Happy to take questions now or later as well. So from me, that's all, folks. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And you gave us a good deep dive into what cybersecurity actually means for an institution like ADB. We felt like it was useful to share with our audience because really we are not that different from many government institutions that need to think about cybersecurity. And we can come back to that during our discussion. Let me now go to our next speaker. Mary Jo, if you can switch on your camera and come live, that would be fantastic. Over to you.
All right, thank you. So if we can just pull my slides up, that would be terrific. So my name's Mary Jo Schrade. As Arndt mentioned, I lead the Digital Crimes Unit for Microsoft Asia. And I'm just going to give you a brief recap of some of the cyber threats that we see through the work we do at Microsoft. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So my group, the Digital Crimes Unit, is basically focused in a number of areas. So we do investigations and criminal referrals relating to malware, ransomware, business email compromise, and a number of other areas that are important to Microsoft and important to our customers. So some of what I'll talk about today is in the lens of the work that we do at the Digital Crimes Unit, while some of it is even broader and encompassing the 8,500 people we have at Microsoft who are focused on cybersecurity. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So where do we stand today? And this is kind of that sort of chilling bit of information, which is just how easy it is to be a cyber criminal these days. So it's obvious that cyber criminals are attacking in all sectors, in all countries, wherever they think they can get a benefit of some sort. But how is it that they're so prevalent? One of the things we see is that the cybercrime economy itself has really grown. So if you were wanting to be a cyber criminal 10 years ago, you would need to really understand how to write code, how to get that code out into people's computers to take advantage of them. These days, people don't need that. There's basically an underground economy that provides all of this for a price. So for example, if you wanted to attack someone in a cyber attack, you could hire somebody for as little as $250 to be able to do that cyber attack for you. If you wanted to engage in ransomware, you could pay $66 to buy a kit that enables you to become a cyber criminal and launch ransomware at a target. There's also another model where you don't have to pay anything up front. You can just offer 30% of the money that you make to the owner of the service, and they will allow you to launch your ransomware. So you can buy access to compromised PCs that have already been loaded with malware for as little as 13 cents per PC. You can get combinations of stolen usernames and passwords, and these are often valued based on what the perceived value is of what that will give you access to. Or you can hire someone to do a denial of service attack for you, to attack another server to take it basically offline. And that can be done for as little as $311. So that's what we're dealing with. And then on the positive side, governments and companies are being more open about exposure to cyber attacks and cyber crimes. They're reporting it more frequently. They are engaging in attribution, where they talk about who's behind it when that's able to be discovered. So all of these are important, as are the new policies and laws that are in place to address this. So let's go to the next slide, please. I'll just stop on this slide quickly just to show you where the information is coming from that I'm talking to you about. So Microsoft, because of the various entities that we have, including Xbox Live and Office 365, and of course Windows, we have over 24 trillion daily security signals that come into our systems. And we have teams that analyze those and parse those both in an automated way and in a more detailed kind of one-off investigation. But this results in over 9 billion endpoints being protected when those threats are blocked, 31 billion identity threats are blocked, and 32 billion email threats are blocked each year. So I won't go into more detail about where this data comes from, but it's anonymized data, but very important information that we use to assess what's happening in the world. And it helps direct teams like mine as to what we should be focusing on. So if we can move now to the next slide. So we heard mention of ransomware in Peter's talk. This is what Microsoft is seeing over the past year in terms of encounters. These are enterprise customers, so not the small business or home consumer users, but the larger businesses. This is data relating to them, and you can see the increase in encounters of ransomware. we have a team that helps these large customers address a ransomware encounter, and these teams have kept track of the kind of entities that have reached out for help. And you can see that it spans across government as well as healthcare. Even though ransomware companies, these criminals say they don't attack healthcare, they do. It really pretty much crosses the range of targets. And the next slide. So phishing and other malicious emails, we see that there are very high levels of attempts at phishing, trying to get people to click on a link to either load malware or engage in some other cyber crime. Most frequently targeted industries are wholesale distribution, accounting and consulting, chemicals, construction, probably because they're interested in intellectual property of these entities, but no entity has been spared. Next slide. So the malware that we're seeing, high levels of encounters with some of these are more technical, and I won't get into the technicality of them, but we're seeing one of the things that we see more frequently now is this encounter with malware that actually changes your search results. So if you were going to search online and it would actually replace those searches with the malware's searches, the links that they want you to click on to further load malware onto your computer when it's already infected. Web shell encounters where a internet-facing computer is attacked in a certain way, those spiked a lot when the on-premises enterprise Exchange servers were being targeted in the spring this year due to a vulnerability. So basically, any place there's an opportunity, the criminals are there to leverage it, especially if a patch comes out and some people are slower to patch. They can go out looking for those who have not patched and then exploit that unpatched system, as the spike shows in the lower right-hand corner was done with the Exchange vulnerability. Next slide. So this was a lot of talk about what the particular issues are, what the concerns are, but what this shows is really what can you do about it? I mean, even as a small business, even as an individual, how can you protect yourself when the criminals are able to just buy a kit for a very small amount of money to launch some sort of cybercrime? And the good answer to this is that sometimes it's the simplest things that actually can protect you the most. So one thing that we tell people is just patch. When a patch comes out, just quickly put the patches on your systems. They're patched for a reason to keep you from being vulnerable to something. And then the second one is multi-factor authentication, which is something you may be familiar with in context of a work or bank where you have a second way of identifying yourself through your mobile phone or some other way. If those two things are in place, regular patching as well as some sort of multi-factor authentication, that would protect people from 98% of these attacks. So just those steps alone can be really impactful, and we can talk more about that later. Back to you, Arndt.
Thank you very much. And this was a really great view of what goes on in our digital systems. And Microsoft, of course, has a massive number of data points that it could look into, as you mentioned. So thanks for sharing this. And I understand that this information is also very fresh from your research. Thanks, Mary Jo. And I'd like to invite Bart to now take us into his work as someone who works with governments, public sector, to build capacity around cybersecurity. Bart, looking forward to hearing your contribution.
Thanks, Arndt, and thanks to the team at IDB for inviting me to speak at this panel. I hope you can see my screen in full screen at the moment. If you can give me a thumbs up or thumbs down.
Not yet.
Not yet.
One more time.
There we go. Good now?
Still not.
Let me try this one more time. I'm sharing the wrong screen. Yes, this works.
Yes, perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
So thanks, Arndt. And as you rightly mentioned, and I think this is a nice lead up in speakers going from kind of the technical work done at the IDB through what Microsoft is seeing in the region from a cybercrime perspective, to probably looking more at what's happening kind of in the public policy space, because that's where I'm operating at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is a think tank based in Canberra, but very much looking at what's happening in the wider Indo-Pacific region, not covering the full area of responsibility of the IDB, but I guess a large part of it. So what we're looking at is really kind of what are the strategic policy dimensions of cyber and increasingly of emerging technologies. What are the implications for national security, for economic security, and what are policy measures that that governments and regional organizations could or should take? What should be on their horizon? So one of the things we're doing for the very first time in the region in a month's time is a first kind of senior level political dialogue on the role of emerging critical and cyber technologies, which we call the Sydney Dialogue. And for those of you who are interested, feel free to sign up and listen to that one as well, where we've got the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, as well as his Indian counterpart, Prime Minister Modi, speaking. And that's kind of the work that we do. So that's also kind of my perspective on this topic on cybersecurity. When I was thinking, let's say about, and I was attending a conference yesterday with a bunch of European Union cyber diplomats, and I think one point was made very clear in that session was we sometimes in a kind of our cybersecurity bubble, we tend to kind of focus on cybersecurity as the main thing. But I think we need to keep reminding ourselves, and that's why it's really fascinating to talk to this audience here today, which doesn't happen too often in my situation, is that cybersecurity is really an enabler for socio-economic development, innovation, digital transformation, and what have you. So that's one thing. The other thing I think, which is always really good to keep in mind, is that cybersecurity really means different things in different places and to different people. And just to give you an example, again, when I was speaking yesterday to the European cyber diplomats and we talked about cybersecurity, we talked about state-to-state conflict and tensions between states and how that's playing out kind of in the geopolitical sphere. I think when we are engaging in Southeast Asia or in broader Asia Pacific, it's much more Asia, I should say. It's much more of an economic story. How does cyber kind of enable and affect and is also kind of a business resource for emerging economies? And when you talk and speak to people in the South Pacific, the small island developer nations, it's about simply how do I keep my data center afloat in terms of a thunderstorm or rising sea levels. Quite literally, when we asked someone from Tonga to give us a spiel about what he is doing in cybersecurity, he gave us a picture of a sea container which contained the data center, and kind of his main thing was to be able to relocate that to higher ground in case of need. So cybersecurity really means different things to different people in the different places. It also means different things in terms of, are we talking about kind of, I think what Peter talked about, kind of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of networks and communications? Are we talking about, in a different situation, also particularly relevant in the ADB's area, cybersecurity in terms of information content, the information environment, which is especially in government circles and in public policy gaining much more prominence, and what kind of tendencies you see there to mitigate, I mean, malicious content and kind of harmful content, and how do you have a proper public policy response? And then obviously kind of there is kind of the bigger geopolitical side to that. I'll come to that later. But I think the main thing is it's all about trust and confidence in the systems that we work with, whether that's as an individual, as a business, or as a government. And when it's about trust and confidence, then there is also a big portion of perceptions or misperceptions at play. There is a high degree of social, cultural, and historical context when we talk about cybersecurity and the mechanisms we deploy to manage that. There is there are questions about risk appetite. So for instance, in the Australian situation, and as probably most of you have picked up on the debate a couple of years ago about letting Huawei compete for Australia's 5G infrastructure. That was not so much kind of a technical discussion. It was a debate about what's the type of risk a country like Australia is willing to take in the broader context of its political and economic relations. And we've seen kind of similar debates with other vendors elsewhere as well. It's also a matter of related to good governance. And when I was listening to Peter's presentation, I thought, well, we also need to talk, let's say, about what is it that we're talking about when we talk about cybersecurity. But Mary Jo, I think, gave a very nice introduction, kind of in terms of the types of threats that we see. And I'm just highlighting a few resources here. So on the bottom left, you see Singapore's cybersecurity landscape from 2020. In the top left, you see a live screen that's being managed by the Indonesian National Cybersecurity Agency, which tracks live incidents coming from different kind of IP locations from across the world. And you see two reports. Of course, I had to credit Microsoft, given that Mary Jo was on the panel. But that's without kidding. I think Microsoft has been investing heavily over the last few years to kind of build a global understanding of what's the cyber threat landscape, not just looking at what's I think what Mary Jo presented about cybercrime statistics, but also what they see happening on the networks, who is behind it, and how that is affecting really the integrity and sustainability of the global network. And you also have increasingly national governments putting out their annual cyber threats reports. I just put a picture there of the Australian cybersecurity centers, but we see more, in particular, the more advanced national cybersecurity centers putting out those cyber threat reports, which is just only helping in kind of creating a common understanding of what is the cyber threat landscape, what are our national perceptions of that, and not just government, but kind of as a whole of economy or whole of society, and how do we then deal with those threats. In terms of what then is our state of play, how what we call cyber mature, or how cyber resilient are we? And I think that's really a big problem, or a big challenge in kind of measuring that adequately. And I'm just listing here a couple of indexes who have tried to kind of capture a nation's cybersecurity maturity or cybersecurity setting. And this is just kind of a snapshot of a few countries in Southeast Asia. But on the one hand, you see kind of similarities, but you also see great discrepancies between how things are being measured. But I think there are probably three key things which are cross-cutting across all the indexes, which is, does a country have processes in place to deal with incidents, to deal with issues around cybersecurity? Does it have adequate processes, whole of government, intra-government in place? Does it have certain capabilities to deal with that? So is that a national cybercrime unit? Is that the National Computer Emergency Response Team with adequate networks across the region? And does a country have adequate policies and laws and regulations in place, again, to deal with security incidents? One is to kind of mitigate an incident, but also how would you respond in the longer term to an incident of kind of national security importance? So that's kind of our state of play. And I think, I mean, our part of the world is not too bad off. And I think it's also really important to realize that this is not absolute, although the index is kind of trying to put it in absolute terms, but it's all relative to the state of an economy. You can't expect a kind of a Pacific Island nation, and I think that was mentioned also in the session earlier today, a Pacific Island nation to build a fully fledged computer emergency response team. But it's about, do they have access to resources and mitigation measures in case of need? Hence, this also explains a great priority that's being attached to a country having national cybersecurity strategies. And I'm just putting a few numbers down there now, which is just more of an indication rather than an absolute number. But across the world, there are now 95 countries that have at least a cybersecurity strategy. 24 are developing a very first, but there are also still 70 countries who don't have an official national cybersecurity strategy yet. And these are not just kind of the the kind of the developing nations. That's also a pretty, I mean, big nations in our part of the world. So, for instance, Indonesia doesn't have a national cybersecurity strategy, and I think only India only got one last year. So this is still very much kind of work in progress. And it's kind of an indication of how aware is a country, a nation, an economy of its cybersecurity posture, and has it kind of looked into what kind of resources it has available. Coming to the end of this, the kind of my presentation, I just wanted to kind of flag, and this is kind of really big picture, an interview that the UN Secretary General gave, I believe it was in 2020 to Wired, and he talked about 3 divides that will determine kind of the cyber and technology security future. He talks about the geostrategic divide. I think, as we all know, kind of the US-China competition and how that's playing out. That's also in our part of the world, and how do we relate to that? And obviously expressing concerns about decoupling so kind of, let's say, well, undermining the open and transparent nature of the cyber environment and kind of the internet. He talks about the social divide, so related to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, of which kind of connectivity is one part, if I'm not mistaken, SDG number 9, and realizing that still kind of about many millions of people are still not connected and are not able to kind of reap the benefits of connectivity, and especially, of course, in the current situation of movement restrictions, having access to e-health and e-education and e-learning and all those kind of things. It's really kind of increasing that social divide. And then finally, he talks about, let's say, the technological divide. And this is kind of also amplified by the UN digital roadmap, is where some countries, and I think you talked about it earlier today, are already talking about AI and cloud and 5G, 6G, whereas other parts of the world are still only just getting connected. So kind of the divide between the emerging and mature nations and kind of those trying to catch up is only growing and growing and growing. And that's kind of from of course his perspective, and kind of given the UN's mandate, of great concern, where we should all try to play our role. And one of the things to wrap up, and you mentioned that in my introduction, is an avenue where it seems the international community is embarking on at the moment, is about investing in cyber capacity building. It's really about, let's say, connecting what I mainly talked about, the international security community with the development community, which I think is largely represented in the ADB community as well, where we really try to kind of build partnerships between those funding and initiating activities, programs, and solutions with the recipients and the providers and implementers of programs. And kind of creating, I mean, what I would call kind of traditional development principles and practices into kind of the cyber domain. And there are just two kind of platforms I wanted to flag. One is the GFC, so that's the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, where your big sister or angry brother, the World Bank, is a member of, where they really try to kind of, well, support capacity building worldwide. And providing the GFC as a platform where needs and requirements from developing economies and developing nations can be matched by expertise and assistance that's available from the community. And the community is states, governments that have resources available, but equally industry partners that are a member of that platform, which also includes Microsoft, for example. And there is, which is a great resource, I think, in terms of when you are, I mean, looking for investments and kind of where do you accompany cybersecurity considerations in kind of more traditional lending and development programming, is the Sybil portal, which captures most, and hopefully not too long from now, all kind of ongoing projects and resources and materials that the global community has developed in terms of building cyber capacities, of cybersecurity capacities. That's it. Feel free to touch base at any time, and also looking forward to questions, comments, and strong disagreements. Thanks, Arndt.
Thank you, Bart. And I want to remind our audience that the Q&A button is there for you to add your questions that I can then put to the panelists. I'll invite everybody to switch on their camera now. And if any of the panelists would like to engage in the conversation, ask a question to their co-panelists, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll get us started with some questions right away. One of the things that stands out from this first set of presentations is that there is a lot going on already. We have an audience here of ADB colleagues of ours, but we also have other interested public officials from government and also private sector participants. And my first question to the panel is really, where do you see a space where current initiatives like the GFCE, for example, where support at country level from private sector service providers like Microsoft that are selling services to governments and private sector, where all these efforts leave gaps? What are the spots where really there is not enough happening? The numbers that you shared, Bart, about 70 countries not having even a single strategy in place is actually quite shocking if you look at the numbers that were presented by Mary Jo. So clearly there is still a big gap. And one wonders whether the collaborative approaches that are currently in place have sufficient speed, sufficient impetus for us to really catch up with what is going on. So I just want to put that back to you to maybe share with us whether you think there is places where really greater speed is required, where we need to amplify, where maybe ADB could play a role. Who wants to take a stab at it?
Who do you want to go first? I mean, I think there's two ways of looking at it. I mean, one is obviously you ideally want each country to have its national cybersecurity strategy, whether that's kind of written in a product or in a document, or at least kind of have that done kind of through a process where most relevant stakeholders have been involved and have been consulted. So at least there is a kind of a conscious understanding, assessment, and a good understanding of what's the cybersecurity situation in my country, and where are my risks that mainly kind of on the government side? Is that mainly coming from state actors or non-state actors, or is that really more in kind of for my individuals, for my citizens, or does it sit mostly kind of within the business community? And I think wherever the ADB and kind of partners in your network kind of can encourage those conversations to take place, I think that's really kind of the first step. And I think we've seen that happening definitely in from what I've seen in the South Pacific, where in particular international donors, including yourselves, have kind of created that impetus and kind of that first step at getting all relevant stakeholders together and have a conversation around that. Yeah, so that will be kind of first part of my answer. Mary Jo, over to you.
Yeah, I think although the topic of cybersecurity can be really complex, I think there's some fundamentals and foundational things that can be done. Peter talked about that and the ISO standards and NIST and things like that. So things have already been invented. We don't need to reinvent these things. We can take advantage of the learnings that other countries have had and start with that baseline. And I think, building on that will enable you to start from a higher plane than you would otherwise. But I would say that as countries are thinking about it, that it's when you think about it in such a broad spectrum, it's impossible to ever get started, but it's like building blocks and you put them down and then the next layer can go on top of those. And so I really think it's important to get the foundations right and then figure out and work with partners on how you can build on those.
And I agree that, Mary Jo, it's great. Quite often I see people select a small project, put their toes in the water. Don't suddenly go out and go, right, we're going to have an online government system. We're going to do our banking. We're going to have all these big things. Choose a small project. I've seen some very successful ones. ADB's assisted in some in the South Pacific, again, around digital identities, just, really working with the governments, taking small projects, getting them live. get some expertise. Again, those standards, and I love NIST is a great example. The early standards talk very theoretical, but the later ones are quite detailed in the approaches. And don't be afraid to get expert help. Reach out to organisations like ADB or even some of the expert in those fields. There is lots of experience out there.
And I thought one thing that Bart said about him participating in this panel and the usual panels that he participates in is a very interesting point. This bubble of cybersecurity professionals, the cybersecurity institutions, people who are working on this day in, day out, how well do you see that conversation rippling through the broader let's say society, digital economy, because that's really what seems to be needed. I think most of the international organizations like ADB are well aware, banks would be aware, larger enterprises would be plugged into this conversation. What about the very small shops, the MSMEs that are now coming online, that are dipping their toes in the water in the digital economy? Mary Jo, have you come across that in your research as something that is particularly pressing to look at the small businesses?
I do think so, but kind of going back to my comment on the last question is, I think that that companies and governments can't necessarily go out one-to-one with every small nation, and that's why these things are created that are the building blocks, and that there are entities, and I know you all do a lot. I think there are other entities that do a lot as well, in ASEAN, for example, and taking advantage of those when you can, definitely. And I know Microsoft has worked with some of those entities just to be able to do that broader assisting without necessarily doing one-to-one with every country. So I think taking advantage of what's out there, but also not assuming that you need a tailored specific thing. It may have been created in some concept that you can actually leverage and get started that much sooner, rather than waiting to create the perfect answer to what your problem is.
Yeah, great. I see others nodding. I think that the building blocks concept came up as well in our discussion earlier today when we were talking about cloud computing, and that's switching back to government maybe and bigger institutions wanting to implement a transition to cloud, a transition to digital. This approach of going with small steps, leveraging available tools that are already tried and tested, adapting. So this seems to be a message that counts for the cybersecurity space as well. And then you all mentioned, and particularly I think fits into the first conversation, this point about culture and people's awareness of the risks. The point that you made about patches and the need to really be up to date on just patching up your computer software, preventing such a big chunk of issues. I want to switch a little bit over to an opportunity, and that is around cybersecurity as a business. Cybersecurity is being seen both as an imperative and as an opportunity, and there is a whole industry that could be created in developing countries, but it needs a highly skilled workforce. And the question really is, how do you build up that workforce, and how do you build the skills around cybersecurity to take advantage of that growing industry? What pathways maybe could you suggest, particularly for smaller developing member countries of the ADB that might have limited tech talent, but that could leverage other talents and skills? Sometimes it's language, and sometimes it's just general logic skills or math. Are there pathways that you've seen that you could recommend?
I can go first. Bart probably has some ideas as well, but I know that there's a big drive to drive people into the cybersecurity workforce worldwide. So it's not just a problem in smaller nations; it's a universal problem. And so there's a lot of online skilling initiatives. I know Microsoft has some through LinkedIn and through our Microsoft at Microsoft.com. You can look up the skilling initiatives. But the idea behind skilling people up is not that you have to take people who otherwise are engineers or, you know, have some advanced capabilities already. But I think the idea is that in order to fight cybercrime and to do cybersecurity work, it's often better to have people who come from an environment that isn't like that. You know, that is the way that they think about things, the way that they approach things may be different, and really provide that diversity of background and of methods of tackling a problem. So I think that a lot of companies are trying to help in staffing up workforce, trying to help convert when there is a shift. Maybe if AI, for example, is causing job loss in a particular country, to shift that workforce into a workforce that could be a cybersecurity workforce is a great way to upskill and provide new opportunities. So I do think that there are those resources online where that could be started, and then I am sure there are many partners that could be worked with to help with that skilling.
And look, just even internally, so ADB, we actually give our developers security training. We actually give them secure code development processes. So, you know, it's not there's the new folk, but there's also just, I guess, giving your existing IT people security culture as relates to their workforce. So, you know, getting your coders to remove vulnerabilities before they go into the system, it's a great way to kind of also reduce the exposure to cyber.
Thanks, Bart.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think out loud. I think the ADB recently did a study on kind of the digital workforce, or kind of reaping the benefits of the Industry 4.0, where I think it was quite an in-depth review of kind of all the training institutions across the region that are not just looking kind of in cybersecurity training and skilling and degrees, but kind of more broadly equipping and skilling the workforce of the future, of which kind of the security element is just one part. So I think kind of leveraging those existing this existing educational infrastructure that exists in most of the countries and in most of the regions. On top of that, now I'm just talking specifically about ASEAN. There are, for instance, 2 dedicated cybersecurity center of excellence in Singapore and a cyber capacity building center in Bangkok, which is kind of providing niche training for cybersecurity operators in government as well as in critical infrastructure sectors. So I don't think it's so much a kind of a lack of education or a lack of opportunities for upskilling or reskilling. It's, I think, one is obviously access, but also kind of the scalability, because I think you see most of those programs of obviously targeting either businesses, the bigger businesses and governments located in capital cities, but it's really about how do you reach into countries, especially of the size of the Indonesias and Indias and Kazakhstans of this world, where kind of to reach into kind of the deeper layers of the economy is much harder. Then again, I think what's very particular about kind of the cybersecurity community is that so many of them are, not sure, Peter, whether you can attest to that, are just kind of self-learners. They just kind of start doing things and then they get their certificates as they go along, and there is not always kind of a pre-arranged career path to become a cybersecurity professional.
That's a great point. And you know, I had someone recently ask me, you know, what's the best course I could take? What's the best university? And you know, universities are great about teaching you a nice chain, a good long-term approach, cover lots of areas. but many very successful cyber people are those people who just learn. If you have an interest, get on and start learning. Courses are great, and I recommend them, and they show a good structured approach to things. But there's no reason you have to be structured. There's lots of demos, lots of free training out there, and yeah, as you mentioned, I think experience quite often is just the better way. Find something you enjoy doing and start tinkering.
Yeah, Mary Jo, you have a legal background and you got somehow into this space. How did that happen?
I basically worked in the digital crimes unit as we expanded. So in 2008, we became the digital crimes unit. Before that time, the group that preceded that had originally been more of an anti-piracy group. And so as we shifted our focus less to protecting our assets and more to protecting our customers, we started ramping up. So, like Peter said, we took courses and got certifications in a variety of topics just to bring ourselves up to a certain level, but also learning on the job and learning from experience and just being involved in things. You can't underplay the importance of that. I think that having the chance to get hands-on, that really helps a lot.
And nowadays, even the mechanical engineers, the people who look after IoT solutions, everybody who deals with anything that gets somehow digitally connected needs to have a degree of cyber awareness, isn't it? So, the whole field of cybersecurity is going to branch out into many other professions. A couple months back, we had a conversation about the Philippines, and we were talking to a vendor, cybersecurity vendor, who was saying that there is a massive need for professionals in the local market, and that vocational training institutions are not able to provide the number of people that could actually be absorbed in the job market. Hence this question about the opportunity. And it seemed that the Philippines, where call centers have long, provide lots of jobs for highly skilled, English-speaking people, this was a very good growth opportunity, because not all the jobs seem to be highly technical. A lot of them require, you operating a system, which seem to be possible as upskilling. Thanks for these views. I want to switch to something that kind of emerges from this question, and that is about the increasing use of AI. So while we do need humans to look at these systems and interact with them and interact with customers and identify unusual goings on, there's also an increasing use of AI in these workflows. And is there a hope that AI would actually manage to quickly overtake the human capabilities, and that we can faster and quicker react to threats by deploying more and more AI in cybersecurity?
I can start by saying that I think AI right now plays a role, but there still is a human role, and part of that is that AI can synthesize large volumes, large quantities, and AI can also pull out anomalies that it would take humans many weeks of going through data to identify those things. And the way it's set up now, that is done, and but when it comes to that assessment of the anomalies and how they play into other things, there's still a role for the humans to make decisions. And I think as systems improve, there still will be a role for humans. It may evolve over time into different things, but I think it's still important, in part because AI can do a lot and can sort of sort through a lot of data to pull out the most important parts, but still there is the need for someone to synthesize that and to understand, relative to other information, what the implications of something is.
And my take, and I couldn't help but smile when you brought that up, Aunt, is that AI, I think it needs to be managed. It can be poisoned. People can manipulate it. From a cyber perspective, at this stage, I kind of see AI playing a much more important role or significant role in the attack side rather than the defense side. I think, you know, it's challenging, it's there, it's certainly good use, and, you know, the difference between AI and, for example, heuristics, where you're kind of looking at it. So there's lots of good use for intelligence application of logic, but the actual AI piece, I think, is still a bit further off, but no doubt it will need to get in there as attacks come thicker and faster, and it's easier to kind of morph attacks as they go, that there really will be a place. I think at this stage it's still a bit early, still a bit of a toy, but, you know, certainly something attackers use at this stage much better than defenders can.
Very interesting. And I want to get to a question that's come from our audience. Thanks a lot for putting that up, Barre. And I think this is a question that I could pose to Mary Jo, who comes from the industry, but also to others just for an opinion. And he or she would like to know why vendors are not legally responsible for vulnerabilities that are found in their products and damages done from these vulnerabilities. And he or she says, in the car industry, car makers are responsible for any safety problem found in a car, but this is not the case in the software industry. Whether we as a panel think that the overall cybersecurity would be improved if vendors became accountable. Can I put that to the panel?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think that that we are accountable in many ways, and I think the analogy of a car is an interesting one, because you can do an analysis and assess that the brakes failed or something like that. When it comes to the implementation of software, there are so many variables in terms of the way that it's implemented, how it's patched, you know, where it's used, if it's used for the intended purpose, if it, you know, there are just so many other things that I think it would be difficult. With that said, I do think that software companies do have accountability, and that's why we have these big patch pushes and things like that. I mean, there's always someone trying to attack software, especially if it's widely used, and there's not always someone trying to break into your car. But with that said, I think that we do have a view that it's important to our customers, and we are pushing out patches and doing other things when we're made aware of a vulnerability. And we have teams that are always looking for those vulnerabilities. So it's not as though we launch software and then ignore it. A lot, and other software companies do the same. But I think that the analogy is a little bit different when it comes to software versus a car.
I'm glad you went there, Mary Jo, and you know, that legal background. I was going to start to say there's always those great user acceptance documents, disclosures you need to accept as well, and you know, there's lots of protections built into there. And I think you're right. You know, the purpose and the design, and you know, as someone who's kind of responsible for ensuring systems operate, you know, we can't always patch them, and I think it would be very, very difficult to actually prove liability unless you were, you know, in a very niche set of circumstances. And then typically most software is tested well enough that it's going to perform appropriately in those circumstances. But I absolutely get that frustration, and I've heard that comment many times and never heard anyone who could really nail a great answer to it.
Bart, you?
Yeah, I'm not sure I got too much to add there. I think there are maybe three things that come to my mind. I think one is, and that's again kind of more from a public policy perspective, is that more and more countries are kind of trying to promote, either from government angle, but also, let's say, from industry, to have what they call coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies or frameworks in place. So there is a system in place when people find vulnerabilities that they can be patched before they're being made kind of publicly available, and people can make kind of misuse of it. And I think most of kind of the vulnerabilities we will never find out, or or it's very unlikely that they have been kind of misused, or that you have been kind of at intolerable risks. Only the ones, of course, that make it, let's say, in the media are the ones that are the biggies, which have been exploited for different reasons. The other thing, and I think the analogy of the car is interesting, but of course, in this environment, kind of things progress so quickly. So a software product can be perfectly secure yesterday, and then because of technologies and things changing and developing, things are insecure tomorrow. So, and I don't think you can blame that on a vendor or service provider. I think where it has been really I think a strong concern is kind of around IoT devices, which are kind of renowned to be insecure. And I think that's where kind of a push came for producers and manufacturers of IoT kits to really, boost their, certain cybersecurity standards. So I don't think it's an issue of kind of the big tech companies. They all mostly take their responsibility. It's kind of more that kind of the micro products that are mostly at risk.
Yeah, there would also be very different needs in terms of level of security. For example, I can imagine a surgical robot needing a very, very high level of security, and also some level of legal responsibility for that being provided before any patient would agree to be operated by that robot. So I guess different levels also matter. We have one question on whether we would recommend going 100% cloud. I think the result of the previous panel was to say no. It all depends. And very few people would go 100% cloud, or organizations would go 100% cloud. It's now possible, but the recommendation is very much it depends. As a roundup question before we close our panel, I wanted to collect your views on the trend that we're seeing in terms of going more and more mobile and onto personal devices. We've seen that happening during the pandemic. Many people needed to work through their phones, through their laptops at home. And that has opened up a whole new threat landscape and vulnerability landscape, I should say. Mary Jo, did that come through the recent research as something that has impacted the overall cybercrime statistics?
Yes, I think that cyber criminals will go for wherever the weak link is. IoT devices was one example that you had brought up. That when they created the malware botnet called TrickBot, they leveraged home routers as what they used as the command and control infrastructure for that. So I do think that wherever there's a weak point, there is a vulnerability. But with that said, it's not something that businesses should just give up on. I think that it's important that you control the devices that your employees use, even if it's their personal device, that put security, there are security protocols that you can put in place on their devices that enable them to safely access your systems. And I think it's not too much to ask to say, if you want to use that device, you can, but you just need to put this software on that will protect the device, and then you can allow that. So I think there are ways to get around the problem and the vulnerability. That's what Microsoft has done and many other companies have done. And it doesn't mean you have to invent something yourself. There are solutions out there that can be leveraged.
Thanks, Mary Jo.
I'll jump in. It's quite interesting. Many years ago, organizations used to protect themselves. They had a big hard firewall around the outside, that classic old Fort style mentality with the drawbridge coming in. As more people work remotely, work from home, the industry and financial services as well is adopting something called a zero trust approach, where effectively, the aim is to design access to information or an application such that you're not relying on protection. You're actually assuming that someone's on a compromised, vulnerable device, and yet you're still able to operate effectively. Now that gets more challenging when you're trying to share information like Word documents and and online collaboration information, but applications that's much simpler. But yeah, there's the big zero trust. I just want to jump back to that medical device thing you mentioned, because effectively it's kind of the exact opposite. Quite often medical devices can be so specialized in their hardware that firms don't provide driver updates, and they get so vulnerable. And that's why hospitals are such big targets for ransomware right now. And it's such a critical issue, because niche hardware, vendors don't maintain it for long, but to get your return on investment, hospitals have to keep using it. So yeah, it's not always what you think sometimes, but yeah, the zero trust is a big initiative that will really change the way we continue to work moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, for my end, I think if I'm remember, I think the tips and tricks that that you gave, Peter, and you as well, Mary Jo, in terms of kind of what are kind of the basic cyber hygiene steps that you should follow as an individual, whether you are kind of operating within your kind of your enterprise network or your government network or at home. These don't really change very much. I mean, so having two-factor authentication, don't click on websites that don't have kind of the lock, and all these kind of very basic things. Being careful for opening emails that don't look like you should have received them. It doesn't really matter whether you're in the office environment or outside the office environment. These are just kind of basic cyber hygiene steps that you should follow regardless. And I think the mantra that was, I think, once introduced by the technical director of the UK National Cybersecurity Centre. He said you can look at all kind of the most advanced techniques and things and controls you can put in place, but it's really about doing really the basic, simple things at scale. So as long as everyone has the things I just mentioned, that already would make a tremendous difference to the work of Mary Jo and Peter and their equivalents in each and every organization. Final point from my end, and just getting back to what the keynote speaker mentioned at the start of today's session earlier this morning, your time, where he talked about, I think, 40 million people that got online during COVID for the very first time. And I think that's kind of a community that we should really focus on, because they are entering the internet mostly on a smartphone, and they entering an internet that is not kind of the nice and peaceful internet of the 1990s, but of a very competitive and potentially harmful place. So how do you get kind of the newly connected, who just kind of discovered the smartphone and the application and everything that comes with it? How do you make sure that they can act safely, responsibly, and with confidence?
Thank you, Bart, and thanks for looping it back to the beginning of today. At the end of our session, that's always welcome. And I think your point about doing the basic things at scale is also a nice message to end on. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this panel. Peter and I have our hands full doing more work on cybersecurity in ADB and making sure that this audience and all the people who would be watching this recording later get up to speed, get involved, and start addressing cybersecurity heads-on in our work. Thanks so much for joining, and I'll hand over to Uni for the closing. Thank you.
Thanks, Arne, and thanks all the panelists for sharing your insights today. So before we wrap up, I'd like to ask everybody to take a minute to answer the poll and tell us what you thought of today's session. And once you leave the session, you'll also get an email from us asking to provide us with feedback so we can improve on our future creation. Okay? Thank you in advance for your time. On that note, tomorrow we have another panel discussion entitled Trade-offs or Synergies data privacy and protection as engine of data-driven innovation. It's a long title, but I think it fits nicely with the conversation that we started to build from this morning, where both cloud and cybersecurity, when you're approaching these as building blocks to digital economy, data privacy and protection also plays a role as a key enabler. And we'll be hearing from leading thinkers, regulators, and industry leaders on how we could strengthen the data privacy and protection framework in the region. So that wraps up today's event, but we have many more sessions till the end of this week, which is the final week of the Digital X ADB. So thanks again for tuning in, and we look forward to welcoming you back at Digital X ADB. Thanks everybody for joining.